welcome everyone to this webinar. It's going to be on navigating geopolitical risk in a general sense, and also in particular the sort of legal and practical implications for businesses and investors on that. It's an event that's being joint organised by Theiss and by Aperio Intelligence, and we're delighted for you to join us. I will kick off with quite a high-level overview of geopolitical risk, a sort of amuse-bouche, I guess, and then Bogdan Bibicu from Theiss and Ursula from Radu-Fernolend from Aperio will get more into the nitty-gritty. Bogdan looking at the legal ramifications that the companies need to be thinking about. Ursula more on the intelligence and informational side. So, as I say, my name's Charles Hollis. I had a long career in the risk and geopolitical risk field, first half of it in the UK government, in the UK diplomatic service, and after that in the consulting world. Before joining Aperio, I was running a highly respected geopolitical risk advisory firm, Phalanx Ascent, which really served major international clients, providing them with geopolitical risk analysis. Since joining Aperio just over a year ago, I'm heading up strategic intelligence there, which also includes our geopolitical risk offering. As I say, I'm going to start with a pretty high-level overview of geopolitical risk, what it means for businesses and investors, and to look at some of the mitigation and response strategies. To start off with, I'm going to share a few slides with you, if that's all right, if I can get my... I think I... Good. Can everyone see that? Great.
Yes.
I mean, clearly geopolitical uncertainty is everywhere. In the last few years, it's the thing people have been talking about. It's kind of the new rock and roll. Everyone from banks to communications companies are trying to provide some form of geopolitical risk advisory, not always with great success. But it's quite clear that, newspapers, The Economist, FT, Wall Street Journal, all are increasing its emphasis on geopolitical risk as an important factor in business decision making. And I was struck by one survey undertaken by Ernst & Young in July 2023, when 99% of the more than 1,000 CEOs they surveyed claimed they were proactively shifting their investment strategy in response to geopolitical challenges, which is pretty striking, given that, for the previous 20 years, we were all in this very comfortable world of relative geopolitical certainty. Now, of course, multiple areas of concern that people are keeping an eye on. US, China, clearly one, Russia, Ukraine, US policy frameworks, sanctions, tariffs, the rise of ethno-nationalism. I mean, I could go on and on. The fallout from the October 7th attack on Israel and Israeli responses, which has, had repercussions across the whole Middle East region. And then in specific regional or country risk dynamics, often exacerbated by global forces. But I'm no Central Eastern European expert. Luckily, Bogdan and Ursula are. But even as a non-expert, I can look at events in countries in the region. I know Romania's been through quite an interesting few months. Poland, we have a second round of the presidential election on Sunday. Once more pitting sort of liberal centralism against conservative nationalism. Austria has also had some interesting developments. So geopolitical risk is not just global; there's local as well. And as the Americans would say, all politics is ultimately local. So it does affect local businesses. I've got a few charts which I thought it would be interesting to look at. The first is from the World Economic Forum, their Global Risk Perception Survey, which was presumably polled at the end of 2024. Clearly, the WEF have a panel of about 800 experts they call on, not all business by any means. But clearly, state-based armed conflict has the #1 slot of the most perceived risks, followed by extreme weather events, geo-economic confrontation. I think a more kind of telling survey, however, was undertaken specifically with CEOs, and this was by an organization called the Conference Board, their C-suite outlook. And this is geopolitical factors which business CEOs thought would have an impact on their businesses. So it's much more granular, it's much more business focused. In my one, the US EU China tension is slightly obscured by a box, but that was cited by over 40% of CEOs as an issue which they thought was going to have a big impact on their business. Then global political instability really just behind it at 39.3%. Political uncertainty in the operating regions, 35%. And then cyber attacks at 25%. War in Ukraine, perhaps interestingly for the CEE, was only 8%. But this is a much more granular, I think in some ways more useful survey. Specifically looking at geopolitical risks, that WEF tends to look at more general risks. And also because the WEF doesn't like to actually point the finger at any particular countries or individuals, they're more nebulous in their categories, whereas this is much more specific. However, to get back to WF, I thought they also put out 2 and 10-year time horizons. And I think the contrast here is very interesting. The 2-year one is clearly much more granular and much more diverse. Whereas 10 years out, I mean, I guess the good news is that we've clearly achieved world peace, because the WEF, nobody in the WEF cites that as a geopolitical risk. It's all focused on climate and technology, effectively. We do have inequality and societal issues sort of low down, but it's very interesting that 10 years out, how little detail their experts have on what the risks are going to be. I think, you know, the 10-year horizon, I think, and this is almost valueless. I also thought, as a matter of fun, we could go back over past WEF risk perception questionnaires. So I went back from the 10 years from 2007 to 2016, just to see how consistent they were or how much they changed over time. And again, it's one thing I think is really striking is how reactive all these predictions are in retrospect. 2008 financial crash. There is clearly in 2007, in 5th place, a bit of concern about asset price collapse. But then the biggest financial event since the 1930s is effectively missed in advance. From this, you wouldn't know that the Arab Spring happened in 2011, because certainly it's not predicted. And actually, it's almost unreflected at all. The invasion of Crimea in 2014, well, it does mean interstate conflict blips in 2015, comes out of nowhere. But it's also interesting to look at sort of the latter 2012 on, and obviously in the 10-year time horizon, nobody's predicted COVID as a major global risk. Nobody's predicted further Russian aggression as so I think looking at these sort of risk perceptions is interesting, more for what they don't reveal than from what they do reveal. I'm going to try and stop sharing now whilst I come back and talk to you directly. Good. Am I back?
Yep.
Great. So I think what can we take away from all these surveys? I think firstly that perceptions versus reality. Humans are really very bad at forecasting risk. I mean, there are psychological studies that demonstrate that, and even worse at estimating probabilities and likelihoods. I think what the surveys very much show, particularly the retrospective ones, is we tend to project current or recently occurred risks and weight them far more highly than a true analysis of the risk landscape would really merit. And I think we also allow our personal prejudices and hopes and viewpoints often to override analysis itself. So yeah, I think there's a real lack of rigor about the way some businesses also approach their geopolitical risk side. I think businesses in particular struggle with identifying the full range of risks, including particularly second or third tier consequences. They may see what's a problem for them. Oh, well, US China, that's an issue, but we don't have any exposure to China. Yeah, but you may have a supply chain in Vietnam, and the fallout from the bigger risk is certainly going to impact you. And so people tend to be bad at analysing the full context and the full list of consequences of events. I think sometimes they also miss the interplay of geopolitics on adjacent risk areas such as economic or social risks, environmental risks, and again, as we going to talk about later, I think tariffs, sanctions. Those are very clear consequence of geopolitical risks that people don't really think about it ahead. But we know that if there is a rogue state or an area of tension, the likelihood of regulatory response to that is high, and yet people still seem to be surprised by it every time. I think businesses are not good at filtering out the noise to focus on what the real present risks are. They tend to look at things they can control or can easily control rather than things that actually might be more threatening and dangerous. I think also the issue is you can't predict or influence everything, so you need to prioritize and understand what you can do and what mitigations are available, but to know those and actually to have them, if not in place, but at least you know how you'll do it if you have to at short notice. So a lot of it is translating the relevance of geopolitical risks to businesses on a practical level and integrating them into business decisions, and also developing appropriate responses and mitigations to either real or potential identified risks. But developing practical solutions is easier said than done. I mean, I think what companies do need to do is test and refresh their understanding of their geostrategic risks on a regular basis, but keeping it focused and keeping it in a relevant time frame. There's no point having massive blue sky exercises which are so diverse and broad that they're almost meaningless. And I think some of the WEF risk perceptions are so broad, so vague that they're almost unusable. Um, Really, businesses need to look at their own points of exposure, their supply chains, their vulnerabilities, their operational holes, and assess where they are and what would happen in the event of something that erupted them. And I think a lot of companies don't actually do this, which is very surprising. I mean, I know from a very UK perspective, it was quite clear from polling data that there was a 50% chance of Brexit happening in 2016, and yet business as a whole made really very, very little provision for what was a 50-50 probability. I also think in the lead up to the Russian invasion in 3 years ago, that actually the probability of that happening was more than 50%. And yet I suspect on the whole, all the businesses I talked to acted as if it was a phenomenal surprise because no rational person would do that. Therefore, it won't happen. Therefore, we don't need to make any provision for it. And that's frankly naive and irresponsible to your shareholders. I think companies need to be better at considering and mapping hidden or second tier risks and vulnerabilities, creating practical and appropriate contingencies and mitigations and proactive response strategies. And in terms of these kind of contingencies, mitigations, and response strategies, they can be on multiple levels. Operational ones to build resilience in advance. Communication strategies, quite often external and internal. It may be knowing what you're going to say to your government, your host governments, to your shareholders, to whatever. Give some thought to what your communication strategy is if an event happens. And again, I mean, it was very obvious to me after both 2022 and 2016 in the UK, companies had no position to talk about. So for a week, they said nothing. I think a government affairs strategy can be very proactive and useful. I think the danger of government affairs departments in companies is they often become ambassadors for current regulatory regimes rather than actually thinking about what happens if that government or regulator changes and the landscape changes. But companies need to work out. But then two key areas which companies really need to look at in advance, and Bogdan and Ursula are going to focus on these, are legal strategies to ensure that your business and your your investments are in the best possible shape, and everything is buttoned down as far as it can be buttoned down, both in terms of contracts and other legal exposures. And then a robust understanding of your real operating environment, who you're dealing with, and how that can affect you. So, as I say, I've done a pretty high level introduction. There will be room, I should have mentioned two things actually at the start, for questions everyone after. We're going to have a Q&A session once all three speakers have spoken. I should also mention this is being recorded, this event, so it should be available later for those who wish to review it. But listen, I will now pass on to Bogdan to talk about some of the legal questions that companies should be considering.
Sure, and many thanks, Charles, for the insights and practical points. Before I delve into various practical points and examples and so on, a quick introduction on our firm and our team and the practice. I'm working for Theiss, which is a leading independent law firm in Central and Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe. It's a full service law firm, so we are assisting clients in all sorts of projects, matters. So starting from entry into new markets, transactions, restructurings to disputes and other matters. I'm co-leading the corporate investigations, crisis response and compliance practice in the region. And an important practical element for our firm and our teams, we work in a unitary and coordinated manner, so we ensure kind of seamless coordinated teams for clients whose matters are of interest for several jurisdictions. So we can assist with a single point of contact and basically saving time and resources and addressing risk situations and solving matters in several jurisdictions at the same time. My professional background is older and wider. I started working as a private practice lawyer in the region almost 25 years ago for the Magic Circle firm Linklaters that was entering the region back then. I was working for them in the region and in London, and back then I was doing a lot of privatization, financing, project finance, because let's face it, compliance and risk back then were very low on the risk map and the statistics that Charles mentioned earlier. The situation evolved into an interesting development. Romania back then was in the process of acceding to the NATO and to the EU. So I was part of several legal and judicial reforms, including risk assessments for various actors. And Romania was the first country that introduced the concept of criminal liability for companies. That was the first country in the region. We introduced it back then in 2004. It entered into force in 2006. And other countries in the region followed after 2010. So I started to develop the compliance, corporate criminal liability, white collar and crisis response. And as some of you may be familiar, Romania was also very active on the anti-corruption front in those years as part of the commitments it had when acceded to the NATO and EU, and as part of the regular monitoring by the European Commission for both Bulgaria and Romania as part of the mechanism for cooperation and verification. Now, linking our team's experience to some of the points that Charles has mentioned. Obviously, Aperio's team's work and our team's work is very linked and dependent on those various risks, and our clients' operations are dependent on various geopolitical, economical, social changes, weather catastrophes or other events in our region, and we follow up closely to help them and kind of proactively prevent if possible, or immediately address crisis situations from various perspectives, and compliance, legal, regulatory, and enforcement risks have been quite high on the agenda of companies, especially I would say in the last 5 years, to shorten basically the longer calendar that Charles showed to all of us. Uh, some of you may recall that at the beginning of 2022, probably a lot of companies were still trying to catch up with various compliance audit missions or investigations that they could not carry out because of various COVID restrictions and so on. And authorities were also kind of working to catch up on the backlog of cases due to suspended and various lockdown scenarios. Then February 22 came, and we saw how the Russian invasion in Ukraine created huge impact on operational practicalities and other international business relationship throughout the globe. So while while some of the clients were preparing their kind of compliance and legal plans in 2021, starting with end of February 2022, they had to kind of start over and scrap and reprioritize things. We just to give you an example of based on our firm operating in certain jurisdictions in the region, some of them part of the European Union, some of them not. You can imagine the kind of the complexities around the international sanctions regime, follow-ups and quick evolution and updates, especially for clients operating in several jurisdictions and continents. So for those of you familiar with EU jurisdictions like Romania and others, well, we have the EU-driven regulation and various updates and various new packages of sanctions. We had national local legislations. At the same time, clients operating in the region were operating in countries that didn't have any kind of sanctions regime, while other clients, due to headquarters or I know securities trading in the US or elsewhere, or UK, also they had to accommodate and navigate through the various regulations in the UK, in the US, and so on. So we had quickly stepped up and assisted clients in putting safeguards and amending contracts, amending processes, compliance processes, and steps to ensure overall compliance and avoid pitfalls and try to fill in the gaps. Some of you may recall the various inconsistent views or interpretations from local regulators in 2022 or 2023. Fortunately, things evolved. We saw and we are seeing a more and more coordination among authorities, especially the ones in European Union. We've been part of various working groups whereby nowadays the same situation in several EU countries is not treated differently, and we don't see different enforcement approaches and so on. But obviously that took a lot of time and efforts. And linking to another point that Charles has mentioned, relevant for this year, trade wars, tariffs, and trade controls and so on. That's adding another layer of complexity. And overall, what probably has remained kind of constant in this region, irrespective of the various geopolitical crisis events and economical or social events, the matters related to anti-corruption compliance, those remain still high on the radar of companies and high on the authorities' review and scrutiny. By way of background, the European Commission 10 years ago issued its first anti-corruption report at the level of the entire European Union, and basically it identified several corruption gaps or corruption matters, and one of the sectors giving rise to corruption risk at the level of the European Union, it's public procurement, public tenders. It's something that we've been seeing in our cases in most of our jurisdictions, irrespective it was either prior COVID times, during COVID times, or after Russian invasion in Ukraine. And in the last 4 years or so, after the European Public Prosecution Office became operational in Luxembourg, we are seeing more and more scrutiny around the use of EU funds, and that is seen on a rising level from both of tax evasion, VAT frauds, as well as frauds involving funds under the national recovery and resilience programs in EU countries. So that's something the clients are paying a close attention and undertaking additional steps, due diligence, and other processes, especially when EU funds are involved. And that ties also with other of the risks mentioned by Charles when it comes to geopolitical and the recent developments and the defense related funds at the level of the in the European Union. That's something that we are seeing an increased focus and scrutiny on. And probably another very relevant practical points on the fight against corruption and recent enforcement. Some of the countries in the region have kind of active reporting duties when it comes to corruption incidents. So and we saw that sometimes the difference between reporting and not reporting may have huge consequences, both from a not only from a legal and compliance in our jurisdictions, but from a wider group's perspective, especially for those groups part of international continents, the ones related to UK with bribery act, the ones related with France with extraterritorial anti-corruption effects under SAPANDOA, the ones related to Canada anti-corruption laws, and I left it at the end the US FCPA. Some of you may have noticed the rather recent presidential order of Mr. Trump in February, ordering a temporary pause on FCPA enforcement in certain angles, while some of the companies thought that they would immediately get a scrap of their ongoing investigations processes and or a free get out of jail pass. Uh, that's not the case. So we've been in touch with clients and fellow colleagues, counsels in the US, and it's kind of on the contrary. The respective presidential order of Mr. Trump should not kind of lower the standards when it comes to compliance, prevention, and anti-corruption. And basically, none of the respective order may preclude the U.S. authorities from continuing the investigation after the pausing period, or that order does not impact on various U.S. states to continue to investigate foreign corruption elements, such as I know that authorities in New York or California are particularly keen to apply state federal laws to continue to investigate corruption, while some of the countries that were cooperating with U.S. authorities in ongoing anti-corruption investigations basically started to expand their investigations to those companies and or individuals that initially were supposed to be investigated by U.S. authorities. So that's something that we are continuing to keep an eye on, and we are seeing increased interest. Obviously, internal compliance processes and compliance audits are something that are becoming more frequent and more complex. And companies need to address several matters, especially in the last couple of years. So international sanctions, has added a significant layer of complexity and work to companies. Total understanding for our clients and their organizations. They've been under a huge pressure, and they continue to be, including with the new tariffs. And then in Europe, from a even level playing field, we are seeing the developments on the EU anti-corruption directive package, which aims to basically introduce corporate criminal liability in all EU member states. Some of you may be aware that not all countries in the EU have criminal liability for companies. Some of them, some not. So from a even level playing field, introducing that will further raise the bar. And higher sanctions also in terms of monetary sanctions. So that's going to those are going to increase. And international, when it comes to international judicial cooperation on anti-corruption, and there's a kind of a reaction to the US FCPA posing temporary order. We may also mention the recent task force announced towards the end of March by the UK fraud office, the authorities in Switzerland, and the Parquet National Financier in France, on creating international task force aiming to combat anti-corruption and focused on anti-corruption. And we are already seeing new results and new cases. And probably when it comes to additional level of complexities in EU and other challenges that organizations are addressing and have been addressing in the last 2 or 3 years, we should also mention the recent national implementation of the EU whistleblowing directive, which is now gaining traction, and we are seeing more and more enforcement actions. And basically, matters cannot be left not investigated or left uncovered. The risk of doing that are far more serious, especially given that most of the countries have corporate criminal liability nowadays. And I would also highlight the work that our team in various jurisdictions, together with various colleagues in the market, have been doing on updates concerning whistleblowing programs and whistleblowing enforcement, combined with recent evolution as far as corporate criminal liability, or more specifically to Romania, related to Romania's ongoing accession to the OECD, and, for example, the recent enactment of new criminal offenses combating corruption of foreign officials, talking about the wider market and the more international exchanges and business environment. And most of our clients or Aperio's clients operating in several jurisdictions in the region or elsewhere in the world, and basically the practicalities and the need to safely navigate around those several risks identified by Charles, and that are addressed from a compliance or legal perspective by our teams, for example, in the regions, or by fellow councils in other continents or other jurisdictions. aiming to basically create a bridge to some of the points that I know Ursula wants to mention as well. I'll stop here, give the floor to Ursula, and remain here for questions and for follow-ups during the event or afterwards as well. Many thanks, Ursula.
Thank you, Bogdan. Yes, just a very quick introduction on myself. I had the Central and Eastern Europe practice at Aperio, and I have been working in corporate intelligence for more than 15 years now. And the cases that I will be presenting are all battle tested, as the invitation says. So it's all cases that me and my team have worked on. So I would like to pick up the thread where Bogdan has left it and refer to some of the regulatory and legal aspects that he has described by showcasing, as I said, them in 3 scenarios, which are based on such real-life cases. For each of the scenarios, I will try to highlight the relevant measures taken, or rather not taken, by the client, and which could also be very relevant for your own business operations in our region. So, quick overview. Scenario 1 is about inconsistencies in the application of the law due to political influence. Scenario 2 is about sanctions. Scenario 3 is about a deal that was too good to be true. So, the first scenario, the one about inconsistencies in the application of legislation between, let's say, capital cities and on the other side, regional investment hubs in countries of this region. So imagine you are a foreign company with several investments in Central and Eastern Europe. You are planning to open a subsidiary that is not located in the capital, but in a regional industrial hub that has been booming and growing and is very promising. And implicitly, you have to deal with the regional authorities, not only the ones at national level. So you might need a construction permit, a environmental license, or just an independent judge when you have to sue the town hall, for example, for protracting your authorizations, which ultimately delay your operations and cost you money. So after months of delays, you find out that the reason for the protraction was not the bureaucracy, as you were told, but rather the wedding godson. For those familiar with Eastern Europe, you will know who that is, about this institution of wedding godson and wedding godfather. So the wedding godson of the regional political leader happens to be interested in the same market niche as you are, and the regional authorities are delaying your permits and licenses in order to give the godson a head start in the sector. So if you're thinking now of going to the local press or suing, chances are that the regional media and judiciary are also somewhat influenced by the godfather. So in the course of his long-term tenure, this regional political leader has installed his henchmen into key regional judiciary and public institutions. And yes, it is based on a real case. So, of course, in principle, the legislation and regulatory requirements to set up a subsidiary are exactly the same in the entire country. But in this case, the political influence of a local leader and the vested interests of this leader override the consistent application of the legislation and the regulatory requirements. So judicial and institutional independence, which may look and feel appropriate at national level, and in the surveys it may be so, but in reality it could be very different at regional level. Why? Because entrenched political monoculture gravely impacts the rule of law, institutional independence, and predictability, which is so important for businesses. And when hearing about this scenario and political monoculture, you may instinctively think about Hungary, but in fact, it can actually apply in certain regions in any country of the Central and Eastern European region. So this was scenario 1. Scenario 2 is an example of how sanctions can impact you in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm sure you will all be familiar with different sanctions regimes against Russian entities and individuals following the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you may believe, like Bogdan was saying earlier, or Charles was saying earlier, that unless you have direct exposure to Russia, you don't need to worry about it too much and about potential asset freezes. Well, you may have to worry about it after all, or at least keep it in the back of your minds, also while doing business in this region. For example, a Western company wanted to buy a stake in a Bulgarian entity, which was partially owned by a Russian company, which, for the sake of this scenario, we call it Alpha, the company, the Russian company. Before the transaction, the buyer did a sanction screening for Alpha and its Russian parent company, which we call Beta. Nothing came up. Great, all clear. Everyone was happy. They carried on with preparing the deal. Just that it wasn't, unfortunately, all clear. And what the buyer had missed was the fact that the Russian parent company, Beta, only owned 85% in Alpha, not 100%. And the remaining 15% were unaccounted for in the corporate filings. And those 15% were actually owned by a sanctioned entity. You may ask yourselves how that is possible. Well, it is possible because in July 2023, Russia issued a government decree which states that companies may choose not to disclose certain types of information in the following cases, and I will give you just a very simplified overview. It's a bit more complex than this. So if the reporting company is subject to international sanctions, they may choose not to disclose. If the reporting company is based in Crimea, if the reporting company is involved in military contracts or is linked to Russian military or the industrial complex. So basically, almost any kind of entity could arguably be choosing to not to disclose certain information. And among the types of information which such a company may choose not to disclose is also the ownership in other companies. In this case, in our company, Beta. So of course, there are ways to find that missing link of information, of ownership information, and complete the overview of the structure and do a complete sanctions check. But it's much, much harder than it was before this government decree. And before we go to the Q&A session, the third scenario is again a pre-transaction scenario about the importance of thorough verifications when a deal seems incredibly lucrative or, well, too good to be true. So an asset management firm wants to buy a relatively new technology company in Eastern Europe. The company looks financially sound, the product is innovative and aligns very much with the current geopolitical context, as it can be used in the defense industry. At first sight, the company looks transparent. There are no obvious reputational issues relating to the management, and the financials are fine. Most of its turnover comes from public contracts, which to the investor looks promising and shows a high growth potential. And to add to the mix, the investor is given a sense of urgency. They are told that, oh, if you choose not to invest, there's others waiting in line, because defense tech, isn't it, is very high in fashion right now. And so the investor is being pressed to the side, and a deep dive into the company, which included in-depth research, public record research, but also discrete human source inquiries in the country, with contacts close to the government, to the defense industry, and so on, found that none of the principals had actually had any prior experience in defense technology, and industry sources were really puzzled and questioning themselves how the company had such a sudden success. Some attributed it to the geopolitical context and the urge to ramp up defense infrastructure and investment in defense infrastructure. So there's many complexities to this case, but what ultimately surfaced in our investigation was that the ultimate beneficial owner was a completely different person than the owner in the filings, and it was his close relationship to a key decision maker in a government agency that secured the lucrative public contracts the company was winning. And not only was the company's success built on this one unicorn relationship, but also the tender documentation was tailored to the company's product and not the other way around. So what was happening here was a very professionally done case of window dressing, if you will. Highly lucrative, sense of urgency, the perfect fit into the current context. And yes, the client walked away from the deal as, based on our findings, they realized they would be de facto buying an empty shell that grounds its profitability solely on this one political relationship. And given the frequent government shifts in the region, that wasn't at all sustainable, even if it had otherwise been completely legal. So these were the three scenarios. And before we go to the Q&A session, what I would like you to think about is, in all these three cases, is the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of not having done the adequate checks at the right time. And I will leave you to decide whether that opportunity cost is higher or lower than a pre-transaction reputational due diligence, an industry sector analysis, or a thorough sanctions check. Yeah, that was it from me. And I would now open the floor to questions. You can either type them into the chat or raise your hand and ask. I think we have one. The question is, I will read it out. Has Aperio been monitoring the recent corruption and mismanagement scandal at Hungary's central bank? what if so? What effects is it having on Hungary's financial sector and regulation? We have, well, I will say, I can say quickly something, and maybe Bogdan, if you want to add something after that. So we have been following it only as much as it is in the news, really. So we haven't had a direct request related to this scandal. And I mean, the way it affects the Hungarian financial sector, obviously the impact is not a good one, and is putting further pressure on an already very, like in my first scenario, on a very politically monocultured landscape, which ultimately is, well, it's affecting the financial sector, but also all other sectors in the country. So I wouldn't really know what else to say on this, also because it's still sort of developing.
I would just add, so apart from the fact that it's developing, probably it ties with the other some of the other geopolitical and economical risks that Charles has mentioned. So we are all seeing in, I know, various sources of media, various discussions at the level of EU about I know, Hungary. Uh, Complaints around the rule of law, or any kind of threats about suspensions of votes at the level of the EU. It's not something that you, Charles, or I cannot comment or take a stance on. It's something that we are all looking into, and it's something that I know our clients are also kind of closely monitoring and following.
If there are other questions.
I've got one thing to ask Bogdan, actually. I mean, I was talking to a corporate counsellor at an Eastern European company recently. He was saying that with all the geopolitical instability, what used to be very boilerplate issues in contracts, such as force majeure clauses, are now being opened up and renegotiated, and people are. Is this something that you're experiencing in your area of the world?
Yes, Charles, quite so, and probably I know some of these clauses on force majeure started to be more carefully looked into and addressed during the COVID times. That really came as a kind of not expected. Then the war in Ukraine added another layer of scrutiny and changes and reviews. Obviously, the situations where there are disputes has risen. So we are seeing a lot of disputes, litigation, arbitration arising from this kind of new situation triggered by new geopolitical, economical, or social situations. So our litigation colleagues are having sometimes a roller coaster life in some of these cases. Some of the authorities or even courts in some of the case in instances, jurisdictions said, well, we hadn't thought about that. So, or for example, when this provision in that particular law or code was enacted, we didn't have in mind that I know we would have a Russian invasion in Ukraine and so broad international sanctions that none of us could foresee. And as you've said, it probably some of these elements could have been probably more anticipated if possible. But as you said, it when it comes to sensible, reasonable decision, a lot of the countries and actors in the region or elsewhere on the globe thought that things would remain rational and those matter wouldn't happen. What I would kind of add into this mix is kind of the various compliance related anti-corruption clauses or kind of compliance audit clauses that are kicking in more and more, especially in the last years or so, and especially for those companies part of international groups and international business relations. We see more and more some of those clauses being triggered or kind of reinforcement of the compliance events or anti-corruption events or other non-compliance incidents being looked into and investigated, especially when it comes to third parties or, for example, companies part of international groups where there's a more extensive extraterritorial application of supply chain, ESG, greenwashing, or other such matters. So we are having cases and compliance audits and investigations or authorities cases from those perspective and clauses as well.
Thank you. Well, yes, we're certainly seeing more litigation and arbitration, which is, I guess, good for us, where we support clients in these areas. But listen, I know there's another question. Ursula, do you want to?
Yeah, it's one for Bogdan again, I think.
Yeah, popular.
Are these increased risks and uncertainty affecting the costs of director and corporate liability insurance? And also, are these products becoming more common in Romania?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very practical question, and we are seeing instances where, unfortunately, sometimes companies do not have a kind of a corporate insurance or directors and officers insurance that may at least avoid some costs and cover some of the costs in a non-compliance incident or in either in internal investigations or authorities investigations. So the awareness is still pretty low. I would say that these are more frequent and more known in international groups that have been applying various directors and officers insurance policies prior or at a global level. So obviously, when such risks are relevant, and especially for companies operating in at least one jurisdiction, and it's not only CE but all Western Europe as well. Definitely, I would have in mind as a diligent manager or director to look for such insurance products without making advertising to any of the companies. So it's kind of in the line of prevention and mitigating risk or bridging some of the gaps during crisis scenarios that we are seeing more and more.
Thank you, Bogdan. Any other questions?
Probably Charles and Ursula, we should mention, I know the Q&A session wouldn't end right now. I'm sure your team or our team would remain available for any follow-up points, discussions, or any other practical points that the attendees or their colleagues would like to address or to raise. And we have a hand.
You have a hand.
Charles.
Do I? No. Charles
No,
Crocker.
Hello.
Charles Crocker.
Oh.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. Thank you, fascinating. And Charles, I'm another Charles, so that's the confusion.
Yes, too many of us.
I don't know whether this, when you look at business intelligence and risk and what you've been discussing, whether this comes underneath it and whether you've done any research, but something that was raised as one of the major risks that's coming up is the lowering fertility, which is going to cause potential markets to collapse because the model doesn't work with even if people are living longer, because there are less people based on the decreased birth rates, that the actual model will not sustain that. Are organizations planning for that? Is it in the model? What are they doing about it? Is it part of what you do in raising awareness of this, or is it doesn't fall under geopolitical?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point. One, I suspect, is not technically geopolitical, although there are geopolitical elements with certain countries having proactive measures to try and raise the birth rate. I know President Putin, for instance, is very keen on raising the birth rate. It's very difficult to predict. It's extremely long term. I think that the sort of, again, the second tier consequences and what plays into that, will the rise of AI and robotics offset some of the declining of the productive workforce? That there are so many unknown things feeding into that, and also the actual timescale is still probably decades. I know Japan, for instance, is facing quite acute demographic challenges, and China has now got over the democratic growth, and that'll start facing challenges, as will many countries in the West, Korea, Western Europe, etc. I don't think I could call it as a geopolitical risk. I do think it is a risk which could have geopolitical consequences. But I think it's so early at this point that, assuming most investment decision time horizons, well, if you're doing a really big one like a mine or something, it could be a 30-year time horizon. For a lot of companies, it's going to be a 3 to 5 year time horizon. So it's probably not on their radars for that as yet.
That's fair enough. It's existential. It's not immediate.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're not right that it's existential, but anyway, I
hope not too. I hope not. I hope we can change the trend anyway. But yeah, thank you.
But I won't claim to have full responsibility for fertility issues, I must say.
That's a risk that probably, I know there should be more awareness and quicker in terms of thinking ahead, Charles, and just to add on the insights that both of you have shared. You've seen some of the recent kind of analysis including on stock exchange in the US on the possible severe negative downturn due to the demographical or baby boomers generation decline, or for example what we are seeing in a lot of other European countries where there's basically a huge demographic issue, and basically the raising of the kind of retirement age probably is not the only solution or the only response. For example, recently I was reading the news that Denmark is raising the retirement age to 70. Probably it will be one of the countries that will do so. Probably that's not enough.
Mm. Yeah.
Just to underline what Bogdan was saying earlier. So if you didn't have time, or if a idea of a question strikes you after we've closed the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us and ask, and set up a call with us or ask us for a meeting. We're very, very happy to follow up, and the recording will be available as soon as it's ready, and we will be sending it to the attendees. So thank you very much for joining us and for listening to us, and I hope we will maybe have other iterations of similar events with you and with your colleagues. Thank you very much to Bogdan, to Charles, and thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Ursula and Charles. Great
No.
talking to everybody, and we stay in touch, and totally understanding in such instances sensitive risk, crisis, and so on. Sometimes some of these situations or risks are better addressed on one-on-one. So I'm sure
Correct.
Charles, Ursula, and myself, and our other team members would be more than available to address any follow-up points or other issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for attending, everyone. Thank you, Bogdan. Thank you, Ursula. And yeah, have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
All the best, everybody. Bye.
Goodbye.